My name is Isaiah White. I am 64 years old, and I have spent most of my life shaping small cabins around Lake Michigan into quiet lodges where families could rest and find peace. The work was slow, the winters were long, but every nail I drove into the wood felt like a promise that my wife, Margaret, and I would never have to depend on anyone but each other. When I boarded the plane from Frankfurt back home, I imagined her face lit by the Christmas tree, the sound of soft music playing, and the smell of pine and cinnamon drifting through the house. I wanted to walk in with a small gift and see her eyes widen in surprise. That picture carried me all the way through the snowstorm that delayed my flight and the long drive from the airport. By the time I reached our driveway, the clock on the dashboard read 7:30 p.m. The snow was falling in thick flakes, coating the roof and glowing under the porch lights. The house looked alive, brighter than usual. I could hear music, laughter, and clinking glasses. For a moment, I thought maybe Margaret had invited the neighbors for an early celebration. I smiled and brushed the snow from my coat, ready to step inside. But when I opened the door, the air inside felt different, almost too warm, too full of voices that did not belong. From the hallway, I saw her. Margaret was sitting near the window in her blue sweater, her hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold. Her eyes were red, the tree lights reflected in her tears. Behind her, the living room was filled with people. My daughter Jasmine was there with her husband, Andrew Thomas, and around them sat Andrew's parents and two of his brothers. They were talking loudly, toasting, and laughing as if they were in their own home. Jasmine's smile looked rehearsed, polite, but Andrew's was wide and careless. I stayed in the shadows by the coat rack, listening. No one noticed me. Andrew leaned toward Jasmine's mother and said something that made everyone laugh. Then I heard him say it, calm and confident, like a man sealing a deal. "Once your mom moves into that smaller place by spring, we'll finally make this house perfect for the kids." The words hit me harder than the cold outside. Margaret's fingers trembled around her cup. She looked at Jasmine for help, but my daughter lowered her eyes. Andrew kept talking, explaining plans for new furniture, a redesign of the kitchen, and maybe converting my office into a nursery. Margaret said softly that the house already felt perfect as it was. Her voice broke in the middle, but no one heard her over the music. I took a step back, heart pounding my boots, sinking into the rug I had chosen with her years ago. Every detail of that room held a memory. The clock I fixed one summer, the framed photo of our first cabin, the piano Jasmine learned to play when she was 10. Now it was just background to their laughter. I wanted to speak to end it right there, but something stopped me. There was a kind of cruel peace in watching truth unfold without my interruption. Andrew raised his glass again, saying they would handle the paperwork after the holidays, and that it was good. Margaret had finally agreed to make things easier. I saw her shake her head slightly, whispering that she hadn't signed anything yet. He brushed it off like it didn't matter. Jasmine looked away. My throat tightened. I realized I was no longer part of that conversation, not even part of that family in their eyes. The home I built had turned into a stage for strangers. I stepped outside quietly, letting the door close without a sound. The cold air felt cleaner than the air inside. Snow gathered on my shoulders as I looked through the window one last time. Margaret sat still, surrounded by light, but swallowed by loneliness. I wanted to go to her, but I couldn't yet. I needed to understand what I had walked into. I needed to see how deep the betrayal went. The laughter inside grew louder. I turned away and walked toward the car, the crunch of snow under my feet, the only sound I trusted. That night, I didn't shout. I didn't confront anyone. I just stood in the driveway, realizing I had come back to a house that no longer knew me. When I drove away that night, the sound of the tires rolling over the frozen road was the only thing that steadied me. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that the veins stood out blue against the pale skin. Snow drifted down in slow spirals, and the lights from the house disappeared behind the trees. I kept seeing Margaret's face in my mind, that quiet look of surrender she wore while others decided her fate. The image stayed with me through the dark highway until I stopped at the small lodge in town. I owned that place, but it had been months since I last stayed there. It was quiet, almost sacred in its emptiness. When I stepped inside, the heater hummed softly and the air smelled of cedar. Margaret needed peace. That was the only thought that made sense to me. The next morning I returned. The house looked untouched from the outside, but I noticed the details that told a story. A new SUV parked crooked near the garage, boxes labeled renovation in the hallway, the framed family photos replaced by modern prints of beaches and city skylines. Inside, Margaret stood in the kitchen wearing the same sweater from last night. Her eyes widened when she saw me. She started to speak, but her voice broke. I placed my hand on her shoulder and told her to get her coat. We were leaving. She hesitated, afraid of what they might think. I told her it no longer mattered what they thought. It only mattered what was right. As we drove toward the lodge, she began to talk. The words came out haltingly, as if she had been keeping them inside for weeks. Andrew had been around often since I left for Europe, talking about protecting family assets and saving on taxes. He told her some paperwork needed her signature to update insurance policies. Jasmine insisted it was only a formality. Margaret trusted them as any mother would. She signed once, then again, each time believing it was harmless. But recently she overheard Andrew telling someone on the phone about ownership transfer and approvals. When she confronted him, he smiled and said she must have misunderstood. I listened without interrupting. Each word was another nail in the coffin of my patience. I remembered the first cabin we ever built. It was small, no more than 2 rooms and a porch, but it smelled of fresh pine and effort. Margaret painted the walls herself while I worked double shifts at the mill to buy the roof tiles. We would sit by the lake at night, drinking cheap wine and dreaming about a better life for our daughter. Those nights were filled with laughter and simplicity. Hearing now how easily that life had been twisted into greed made something inside me go quiet. Not angry, not loud, just quiet, like the air before a storm. When we reached the lodge, Margaret sat by the fire while I stepped outside with my phone. I called Sarah Monroe, our old lawyer, a woman I trusted more than most family. It was early afternoon, around 2:30 p.m., and she answered on the first ring. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, then said in that calm, precise voice she had always used, "Isaiah, we can fix this, but it must be done before they act again." She asked me to come by her office immediately. Within an hour, the paperwork was ready, all powers of attorney revoked. Ownership of the house and properties transferred into a lifetime trust under Margaret's control. No one, not even Jasmine, could touch them now. I signed, rid, and signed again. My signature felt heavier than ever before. That evening, as the sun set over the frozen lake, I stood outside the house once more. The laughter inside was softer now, as if the party had shrunk. Through the window, I saw Andrew talking with his parents, his voice sharp, his gestures confident. I took out my phone and pressed record. His words were clear. By the end of next week, she'll sign the final transfer. After that, it's ours. I watched his reflection in the glass as he smiled, pouring himself another drink. For a brief second, I wondered what had turned him into this man. Maybe it was ambition, or pride, or the need to prove something. Whatever it was, it had poisoned the small kindness I once thought I saw in him. Margaret came to the window, unaware of me outside. I saw her glance toward Andrew, then toward the door as if she wanted to leave but no longer knew how. That look broke something in me. I slipped away before she noticed walking back to the car through the snow that had started falling again. The flakes caught in my hair and melted on my face, cold against skin that felt hot from anger I refused to show. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before speaking aloud to no one. I will not scream. I will not beg. I will end this my way. When I returned to the lodge, Margaret was asleep by the fire. The documents were in my coat pocket, safe and final. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and stood at the window, watching the lights flicker across the frozen lake. There was no comfort in victory, yet only clarity. Betrayal, I realized, is loud when it happens, but justice should be silent when it arrives. I turned off the lights, set the phone with the recorded video on the table, and whispered into the quiet room that tomorrow I would take back everything that still carried our name. Cold, silent absolute. The morning light came slow and cold, spilling over the lake in a silver haze. I stood beside the police cruiser parked at the end of our driveway. Sarah Monroe was there too, her briefcase pressed close against her coat. The officers waited quietly, their breath forming small clouds in the air. It was Christmas morning. Inside that house, my daughter and her husband were still sleeping under my roof, believing their plan had worked. But today, they would wake to learn what betrayal costs. The air was silent except for the crunch of boots on the frozen path as we approached the porch. The wreath on the door looked the same red ribbon perfectly tied, hiding the rot beneath. I knocked once, no answer. I knocked again, harder. A shuffle came from inside, then Andrew's voice groggy and irritated. When he opened the door, the color drained from his face. He saw the police first, then me standing behind them, calm and steady. Sarah stepped forward, her tone measured, an official announcing the purpose of our visit. Andrew laughed at first, thinking it was a misunderstanding. He tried to charm, then argue, his confidence cracking in real time. I didn't speak. I let Sarah handle the words. She handed him the documents, explaining how all property had been transferred into a protected trust under Margaret's full control, effective as of midnight. The power of attorney he'd been using was revoked, and every legal right he thought he had was gone. I saw the realization flicker in his eyes like a flame meeting wind. Jasmine appeared next, still in her robe, confusion turning to fear as she saw the papers in her husband's hand. She looked at me searching for mercy, but I kept my expression still. Margaret came down the stairs slowly, her eyes swollen but steady. When Andrew tried to reach for her, one of the officers blocked him. Sarah spoke again, clear and final, saying they had 30 minutes to collect personal items and leave the property. Andrew shouted that this was his family's home. I told him quietly that family doesn't conspire to steal, and that his home was wherever his integrity began again. The house filled with noise, Jasmine crying, Andrew's parents arguing, the children upstairs calling out in confusion. Through it all, Margaret stood near the doorway, one hand over her heart, silent. She looked at me once and I saw the pain in her eyes. Not relief, not joy, just deep, aching sorrow for the family we had lost. The officers did their job with professionalism, guiding them to pack, making sure nothing was damaged. Each minute felt like an hour. When the door finally closed behind them, the silence hit harder than any of the shouting. Snow began to fall again, soft flakes melting as they touched the warm glass of the windows. I walked through each room, the air still heavy with the echo of their voices. The glasses from last night's party were still on the table, half filled, the smell of champagne sour in the morning air. I started picking them up one by one, placing them in the sink, reclaiming the space inch by inch. Margaret stood by the tree, touching one of the ornaments we had bought on our first Christmas together. Her hand trembled. She said quietly that it didn't feel like victory. I told her it wasn't supposed to. Justice is not meant to feel sweet. It's meant to feel necessary. She nodded, and I wrapped my coat around her shoulders. Outside, the sound of engines faded as the police escorted them down the long drive. We sat by the fire for a long time after that. Not speaking, the flames popped softly, throwing light across the floor where their footprints still marked the rug. I thought of Jasmine as a child, the way she used to wait for me by the pier, her laughter echoing through the cold mornings. Somewhere along the way, that laughter had been replaced by silence and entitlement. Maybe I was to blame for part of it. Maybe success had built walls instead of bridges. When the clock struck 10:15 a.m., I realized I hadn't slept in 2 days. I looked at Margaret, her eyes closed now, her breathing steady. She deserved rest, and I would make sure she had it. Outside, the world looked peaceful again. Inside, I knew peace would take longer to return. Justice had been served, but peace had not yet arrived. It was nearly 6 years later when the letter arrived. The handwriting was careful, familiar, in a way that made my chest tighten. Jasmine wrote that she had lost nearly everything after Andrew's business failed. They had divorced, and she now lived in a small town up north, teaching art classes to children at the community center. She said the house no longer haunted her dreams, but my silence still did. Her words were simple, not excuses, just a quiet confession that greed had cost her more than she could ever repay. I sat on the porch, the late calm beneath the afternoon sun. Margaret had passed 2 winters earlier, leaving me the stillness of the home we had fought to protect. The letter lay open beside me. Part of me wanted to throw it away to keep the wall between us intact, but another part, the part that remembered Jasmine as a little girl holding my hand at the fair, refused to let bitterness have the last word. A week later, I drove north. Her life was smaller now, stripped of luxury but rich in humility. I found her after class, surrounded by children showing her their paintings. She looked older, softer. When she saw me, she froze, then smiled faintly. There were no apologies, no tears, only 2 people standing in the quiet space between what had been lost and what could still be redeemed. We talked as the sun lowered over the snowy roofs. When I left, she hugged me once lightly, as if afraid to break the moment.